So it's been a minute since the last video. That's because I really wanted to carefully deliberate on what I wanted to say for this one and made a lot of notes because I didn't really want to leave anything out. There were a lot of points I wanted to touch on because to date, this was the greatest experience of my so-called life as a human being on this planet. And it is my number one favorite psychedelic experience that I've had so far. Even the many trips I've had since this experience, this one still remains at the top. It was my first ego death and crossing the threshold into a full-blown Nirvana experience. And let me also clarify that I'm kind of jumping out of chronological order for this one. All the trips in the previous videos that I've described, they all happened in chronological order as I presented them in the videos. But in the previous video, where I talked about my hallucination of the sort of death and rebirth of the moon, I split that trip up into two parts. So I only covered the first half of that trip in the previous video. I'm going to cover the second half of that trip in the next video, even though this trip that I'm about to talk about now, this Nirvana experience, happened after that trip. But the reason I'm going to go ahead and cover that now is because the second half of that trip goes better with the following three trips that I had afterwards. And so to avoid redundancy, I'm just going to throw that half of that previous trip, skip over the Nirvana experience as far as chronological sequencing goes, and group it in together with those other three trips because they all were basically conveying the same message but with different symbolic language. So I'm just going to kind of group them all together so that we can avoid redundancy, because I know my ramblings are boring enough as it is. So, full-blown Nirvana on LSD. This was on 3 tabs, totaling like around 450 micrograms. This was in February of 2020. And, it was a pretty intense come up, enjoyable, very enjoyable. I got all the typical come up symptoms of, beautiful fractals, and the weather was pretty good at that time. We were starting to kind of head into spring and get a little bit of springtime weather, so it was comfortable enough to go outside with just like a sweater on, no jacket or anything, and sun was out that day, not a cloud in the sky, big bright blue sky, nice and sunny that day. It was very comfortable, and as they say, setting is everything, so that made the trip very comfortable, even though it got very intense. And when I say tense, I just mean kind of like psychologically how to deal with it because of the come up, the tingles and the vibrations get so strong, the visuals start to really intensify, the fractals, the color gets so vivid, and the rate at which the fractals are bursting forth gets so vivid that it starts to take up your entire vision, and you can no longer function in the sober world anymore. You're not even really perceiving it anymore. So, and that's one thing I wanted to touch on about psychedelics that I don't think I've really covered in the other videos, is that once it gets strong enough where you start to approach ego death, in other words, when the chemical starts to kind of, weave its way in between the different components of your mind functions that together, the sum of which makes up the you, the self, the ego, as it starts to kind of break those apart and you see the illusion of the ego for what it is, it's not so much like your ego is still intact, but now it's kind of being given this meta perspective on itself, and it is seeing itself for the illusion that it is. And it starts to realize, like, oh, I'm not a tangible thing, I'm just a phenomenon. I'm an intangible phenomenon. I'm just the effect of the sum of my parts. And that's definitely what this trip conveyed. But there's a stage as the trip is escalating, especially when you take things that are more slow acting and give you a very slow escalation to the peak of the trip, unlike more fast-acting drugs that are very intense and just kind of throw you right into it, like DMT or salvia. With LSD or mushrooms and so forth, it's a very slow climb, so it allows you to kind of better integrate and better prepare yourself as you reach each new tier of the ascent to the peak of the trip. So you can kind of like reassure yourself, talk yourself down, change your setting if you need to. So it's a lot more easy to deal with, I guess, in that respect, when it's a longer escalation to the peak, in my experience at least. But one thing that starts to happen as you're approaching that stage, and the chemicals starting to kind of like pull apart your mind functions so that you can see how the ego itself can see its own self and kind of see how it's constructed. You get this sense of like there's nowhere to get away from this. And what I mean by that is like, it's not that these altered states of consciousness, the first time you experience them, they're not ever painful. I'm going to say that right. I've never had any moment on a psychedelic experience where there was any pain, physically or mentally. And not even necessarily discomfort either, but rather the discomfort, is, if there is any, is in the unfamiliarity of these new sensations that you've never felt before. And so you kind of struggle to orient yourself. It's less like fearing, it's not so much fearing that like that you're gonna freak out or it's gonna be scary and a bad trip or anything like that, and you're definitely not afraid that you're gonna die or have a heart attack or a meltdown or anything like that. It's more comparable to like, imagine yourself suddenly being lost in the woods that you don't recognize. You're not necessarily in any danger. You might even be in a place where other human beings know how to navigate the space, and it's not uncharted territory, and if you could just run into another human being, they can lead you out of the space. But you personally, while you're in that spot that you don't recognize and everything around you is unfamiliar to you, even if it's not dangerous, it's just unfamiliar to you, can start to set in some anxiety because of the uncertainty of it. It's a new environment to you. And that's what a lot of these stages in psychedelics are like as you first experience them. They're not painful, they're not even really scary. They're just new and unfamiliar. And because they're also so intense. And like I said, you get this sense of like, there's just nowhere to get away from this. At least when you experience certain uncomfortable things when you're sober, there's ways you can cope with it and kind of get away from it. Like if you're starting to get a little headache, or you're feeling a little sick or a little nauseous or a little anxious, you can kind of get away. You can walk away from stimuli and kind of, escape to your bedroom or to a dark closet or something like that. You can just kind of breathe, talk yourself down, maybe drink some alcohol or something to calm yourself down. You have ways to cope, and there are ways you can kind of distract yourself from the discomfort that you're experiencing. There's no way to do that when you reach certain levels of intensity with these psychedelic experiences. And so you kind of get this, so just kind of be aware of that. You do get used to it as it goes on, and so it doesn't trigger anxiety when you get enough familiarity with it. But the first couple times you experience it, it does start to kind of trigger a little bit of anxiety of like, there's just nowhere to get away from this. I can't just go into my bedroom and cut off all stimuli and like not talk to anybody, just kind of like, okay, let me breathe. Because when you close your eyes, that state, all those feelings and all those visuals are still there. And in fact, sometimes they're even more vivid when you turn off the lights or close your eyes. And there's just like, you can't escape it. No matter where you go, no matter what you think, no matter what you try to do to reassure yourself, no matter what your rituals are to try to calm yourself down, they can't work because this is something entirely new to your experience. There's just like, you kind of get this sensation of like, all right, I'm open to what's happening, but it's a little too much too soon. Can we slow this down? And like, can I just get a moment to like regather myself? That doesn't exist in this experience. Like once you're in it, and you have to like, it's more like being buckled into a roller coaster. It's like once you get on the roller coaster and you're buckled in, there's no getting back off. You're just gonna have to take the ride as it comes. And roller coasters are fun. They're never dangerous, but no matter how many times you ride roller coasters, when you're going on that slow first ascent, you do start to feel that little bit of excitement, like, oh boy, here we go. And it's kind of like that. There's just no way to get off the roller coaster at that point. There's just no way to get away from this. But I tried anyway, as it was getting to a certain level of intensity. I was over at a friend's house, and I went into one of their rooms in their house where I was just all alone. And I lay down on the bed and tried closing my eyes. And like I said, actually the visuals became even more intense, because when I closed my eyes, I saw very vividly, as vividly as when my eyes are open and sober, a gorgon, yet again. And if any of you have watched my video on my first DMT experience, that was the entity I encountered, was a gorgon made of pure white light. And if you're not familiar with the term, Medusa. I think everybody's familiar with the character from old Greek mythology, Medusa. Gorgons are these, monsters from ancient Greek myths that, had their hair was made out of serpents, and when they looked at you, they could turn you into stone. And so they kind of became a symbol of like protection, actually, because it was the head of Medusa that protected Perseus from, the sea monster. I guess similar to like how gargoyles are used as protection on Catholic churches, even though they're kind of a demonic-looking figure, they're actually a symbol of protection in that respect. And the Gorgon I met in the DMT trip, just go watch that video. It was in no way scary. It was very reassuring, and it felt like an entity that I recognized and had this like everlasting relationship with, and it was made of pure white light. Um, in this trip, I didn't necessarily get the sense that this was the exact same entity, and it wasn't made of pure white light. This time it was like black and white with like a checkered striped pattern. It reminded me of like some of the creatures you might have seen in the old Nickelodeon cartoon Real Monsters, where there were some monsters on there that kind of had these like black and white striped checkered kind of pattern. And it was like that. And she was much more human looking in this visual. In fact, the only part that didn't look human, other than the color scheme, obviously, but the only part that didn't look vividly human was the hair that was, black and white serpents. But everything else about her was very vividly human and very beautifully human. Like, this was a very attractive female, and she was doing like this belly dance and like spiraling around as she was doing it, like, kind of, I don't know, almost like moving her body in very serpentine ways as she was also twirling around, like spinning on her toes and kind of doing this very erotic kind of dance. And then I noticed as I'm witnessing this, naturally, I'm getting very aroused. And as I mentioned a few minutes ago, when the chemical starts to pull your mind functions apart, and the ego can kind of see that it's just a sum of individual mind parts, mind functions that are themselves not conscious, and it can kind of see how itself is constructed, some of your thoughts, it's still you. It's all just you. These aren't external thoughts. You're not experiencing like telepathy from external entities or anything. But your thoughts are starting to come across to your ego as though they are a distinct entity, as though they are, as though it is something else communicating to you telepathically. And sometimes you even hear it very clearly and audibly in like real, actual English words. Though in this particular instance, I didn't necessarily hear words audibly, but there was definitely this impression from somewhere else in my mind that was telling me, like, don't give in. This is a distraction. This is an attempt to distract you and to steer the trip into this way, into indulging in your physical sensations in order to pull you back down and kind of ground you into the physical human bodily experience. So it's trying to distract you with bodily sensations such as sexual arousal. And I just remember like hearing that and being like, okay, yeah, no, this is okay. I'm not actually seeing a real entity here. This is not a real like Gorgon. What this is this is more like an archetypal. This is a manifestation, a symbolic manifestation of my anima in Jungian terms. The anima to my animus. That part of, if you're not familiar with Carl Jung's psychology, it's like if you're a male, you are an animus, and in your mind, you have the counterpart to that, which is your anima, which is the collection of all of your personality traits, all of your psychological traits that are feminine. And likewise, it's inverse if you're a female. All of your, obviously your ego and your self-identification is female, but all of the masculine parts of you, the totality of that, which in many cases we repress, it manifests in your psyche as a male character. Or again, if you're male, it manifests as a female character. And that's what this was. This was like the manifestation of like feminine traits and my sexual arousal and things of that nature. And it was just trying to distract me, to get me to pull I guess you could say pull the trip back down and have more of a bodily type of experience instead of letting the trip continue to ascend and have a more psychological type of experience. And luckily, like that voice of reassurance somewhere in my mind, like telling me, no, don't get distracted, don't give in. This is just temptation. This is just the dangling of a carrot to try to get you to avoid what's about to happen. Don't do that. Let go, give in, and let this happen. And so I did. Like, I opened my eyes up and, like, all right, there's no getting away from this. No matter where I go, or if I close my eyes, if I try to breathe and calm myself down, this just keeps escalating. And apparently, the only way to really, like, distract myself from it is to, like, say, give into sexual urges and other bodily urges. And so I get up and I go outside. Like I said, the weather was beautiful, perfect sunny day. And I go into my friends, past their courtyard into their like paved walkway that leads into their courtyard in the front yard, and I just lay down. And this friend has property, and they live kind of out in the wilderness, so there wasn't any risk of like mailman or anybody like that just driving up randomly and seeing me. So I just lay down on that patio and just kind of bake in the warmth of the sun, and I close my eyes. And you know how even when you're sober, if you close your eyes and look at the sun, you still get bright light kind of penetrating through your eyelids. And that effect really like it took the trip to the next level. It almost like it just triggered something and made it pass through another plateau. And the visuals, the fractals, and everything that I was seeing like became much more vivid, and started to compose like a complete like bird's eye panorama view of like the sky, the earth around me, of everything, of existence. In the center of which was this pure white light. Obviously, the sun on the other side of my eyelids, but as it penetrated into my eyelids, the very vivid visual that I was getting was that at the center of it was this pure white light just bursting forth. A big bang that is just always and forever banging, always creating. And as it bursts forth, as this light spreads out and gets further and further away from its pure white source at the center, the light spreads out and starts to fragment into the 7 rainbow colors we know. And then as those colors start to, the further out they get away from the center point, they also are no longer like just beams, straight beams of light, but they start to kind of wobble and vibrate at different frequencies and wavelengths, and it's kind of chaotic. It's just this colorful rainbow chaotic mess of swirls and bouncing around fractals cascading off of each other. And then as it gets even further out from that, they start to take on patterns and motion that is very orderly instead of chaotic. They start to almost spin like gears in, like old grandfather clocks or whatever. They, or a more accurate description is they start to tumble around like kaleidoscopes. They start to form very kaleidoscope images tumbling around, and it starts to take on more organization and more patternistic, predictable form. And then as it spread out farther from that, you could see that these kaleidoscope effects, all of which were surrounding by the center as the light bursts out and takes on all the stages that I've just described. And it's like outermost layers, you could see that these kaleidoscope effects were evolving into mandalas that we've all seen in like Buddhist and Hindu and other Eastern artwork. Like very clearly, very distinct mandala systems that are just stationary. They don't keep bursting forth past that. They like kind of coagulate and finally settle and become this mandala that's just ever flowing with like color and light and energy, but it's got a very distinct pattern. There's still motion going on inside of them, but they're very clearly mandalas just all over the place. And then as keeping my eyes closed and still seeing this, but it's almost like my eyelids had like, I guess, X-ray vision, so to speak, or at least the illusion of X-ray vision, because I'm looking around and I'm looking at myself and I could still see a silhouette of my body, but with these bright, vivid. I was basically composed of these fractals, bright, vivid, rainbow-colored lights everywhere, just kind of moving and kaleidoscoping, bouncing around, but forming a silhouette of my body as I moved around and observed myself. And as I'm looking around, observing the earth that I'm laying on, and look all the way out to the horizon point, I could see that this entire like three-dimensional universe that we're in, having this human experience, is itself just one section on one mandala. Of all these hundreds and thousands of mandalas that are on the outermost layer of this source, this pure white light that has burst forth. This, I'm not even going to say original Big Bang, but the Big Bang that creates all universes, all dimensions, the other, in this multiverse, not just ours. It is the Big Bang that chronologically was at the beginning of this three-dimensional linear time type of universe that we're in and experiencing, but it's also, it never went away. It didn't stop being the Big Bang at the beginning of our universe. It's always been there. It's the cause of time, and as such, it's sort of outside of time and exists in its own sort of time. It's always been there. This entire past 14 billion years, it's still been there, always and forever banging, always and forever creating other universes, other dimensions, and sustaining the ones that already exist, such as ours. And it's like this trip, this part of this trip was just showing me this, like, this is how the universe that you live in, the multiverse or whatever, this is how existence gets created. It starts at the center with this, like, with this pure white light. Very much, I was getting the impression that this is very much the same, like, pure white light that you hear described in, like, Buddhist schools and even some and other Eastern schools, that it's like it's the source. This is the Tao in Taoism. This is it. Maybe God, if you want to call it that, but I hesitate to call it that because it didn't communicate any qualities of consciousness. It didn't come across as like a living sentient being in the way that we are. However, we still weren't at the peak of this trip yet. It still kept getting more and more intense. And what definitely grew more intensity, the visual aspect of this trip had kind of peaked at this point. The visual part didn't get any more vivid or any more vibrant after this, but the physical vibrations that were resonating throughout my entire body. And this is where, like, when you hear hippies and experienced psychonauts talk about, like, I sort of dissolved into the universe, man, and I became one with the universe. This was it. This was that moment for me, and this was how it happened. Was like I could feel the vibrations not only coursing throughout my physical human body here, but it was like I could feel it extend past the limits and boundaries of my physical body, and I felt how everything was vibrating. And everything sort of had its own little unique frequency. Like, they all had little micro differences between them. Every object, myself, the ground I was laying on, the trees around me, you know, the birds, flying around me and so forth, and these other mandalas and these other kaleidoscope systems that I described a moment ago, they all sort of had their own slightly unique differences between them. But by and large, there was still this same rudimentary vibration or frequency that was at the root of all of them, and that connected us all. I could feel it, and it was familiar. And that part of the vibration grew in intensity and just kept growing. And then remember that voice I mentioned a while back? this other part of my mind that was now like kind of cut off from my ego due to the influence of the LSD, that same voice came back, and this time I did hear it audibly in English words. It was in my voice. I recognized it as, Donnie Jep's voice, but it's like it wasn't coming from me. It was almost like it was this, telepathic message coming in. But I very clearly remember hearing it in English words saying, shh, just ride the wave, calm down, just let go, just kind of give in, and just ride the wave. This frequency that I was feeling growing in intensity was telling me to just give into that, just let it happen, just feel it, and just let it, because it didn't feel bad. It felt really, really good. It was just intense, and it was new to the human ego at least. But like I said, as all these things were growing in intensity, the ego was more and more getting dissolved. And it was more like, if there was anything left to be called a me, it was just a point of observation, observing all these things and taking in data, but not really having much of a reaction to it, certainly having no thoughts or opinions about what was happening to me. It was all starting to feel more familiar. And that's something that I've noticed in other psychedelic trips I've had since this point, is that the less the ego is involved in the trip, the more familiar it feels. And since this time where I had this first ego death, all of my psychedelic trips since then have never been like, what? That's how things really are? I had no idea. Whoa, mind blown. It's never like that. Instead, it's always, 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 holy shit, I remember. And that's when that was happening in this trip. It sort of happened to a significant degree in the DMT trip that I've described in a previous video, but this was like a whole new level of that. This was like once the human self, the temporal human self, was pulled out of the way, and you just sort of bleed out and become one with the universe. It's like, I don't know, some sort of data breach happens, and your human brain, I guess, that's still alive and still functional and activated, now has access to the memory of the universe, which we are. Like I said, in this experience, you finally realize what these new agey people are talking about when they talk about the illusion of separation, man. We're all just one with everything, and everything is one. You really do experience that. And you experience it as a very familiar memory, not as something like new and like, oh my God, I had no idea. It's always like, oh yeah, that's right. This is how it is. This is where we all came from. This is what we all are and always have been all along. And the only thing cutting us off from that memory is the human ego. But anyway, getting back on track. So as this voice is telling me, just let go, calm down, and just ride the wave. That was what it kept saying. I mean, these other phrases I'm just inserting in there because they were just more like emotional impressions that I was getting. But it was just kept telling me, just ride the wave. Shh, just ride the wave. That was what it kept saying over and over again. But it was like conveying this message of like, calm down, just give in, just relax. It's just like falling asleep. So just give in and let it happen, let it escalate. And as this frequency started to grow in intensity, it was like everything else around me, all of these, all the colorful fractal environment around me, and the mandalas and the kaleidoscopes and whatever, it was like this convergence was happening. They were all starting to match that same frequency, and we were all just riding the wave to the point where we were becoming the wave, becoming that original frequency. And as this was happening and as everything was converging, my point of perception, like I said, if there's anything left to still be called a you at this point, my sense of perception was getting closer and closer to the pure white light at the center, to the source, and it was just kind of drifting into it, getting absorbed back into it, becoming it. And as this is happening, and as these vibrations are growing in intensity, there's no possibility anymore. This is where the full ego death happens, because there's no possibility for thoughts anymore. There's just the vibration. There's no possibility for feelings and emotions or opinions anymore. There's just the vibration. When you just let go and ride the wave, you become just the wave and nothing else. There's no memories of being a human. There's no memories of being anything else but the wave. There's no memory or concern for the very concept of time. And I think that's where a lot of confusion happens when people describe who have had altered states, who have had experiences with altered states of consciousness, and some of these people describe as like every moment felt like an eternity. I felt like I was there for an eternity. It felt timeless. Time had no meaning. Time ceased to exist. And when we people who hear that without having had that experience yet, when we hear that, we tend to think like, oh my God, you were there forever? Like, no, it's not that at all. Some part of you, I guess your human body that is still alive and intact and still has that circadian rhythm going, some part of you still knows that only a few minutes or an hour or so is passing. But the mental part of you that's having the experience, it really is like the very concept of time just becomes irrelevant. And so all measurements of time just become the same. They just become that one wave. Whether you're in that state for an hour, or whether you're there for an eternity, or whether you're there for a few seconds, it all feels like the exact same duration of time, because there is no time in that state. So no, it's not like you don't need to get worried and have anxiety of like, oh my God, am I going to be stuck in this state forever? What if I'm here for an eternity? Like all these other people say. It's not like that. I guess it's something you really can't communicate truly accurately. You just got to experience it. But once you're there, that's the best way I know how to articulate it. It's like, it's not like you're there forever, but the very concept and function of the phenomenon of time becomes meaningless there, because all you are is this wave, this frequency, this source, this pure white light, this big bang that is always and forever banging outside of time. It's always just that one moment, that one explosion that bursts forth and gives rise to all of creation, to all of everything, to all that exists. And when you flow back into that and you become this pure white light, and you become just this frequency, that's all that's happening. You're not thinking, you're not remembering, you're not feeling, you're not reacting, you're not concerned about anything. You're just this wave. And I guess the only thing that makes you that wave is that there's still this quality of a perception of it, of something observing it, of the wave observing itself. But even that aspect of it starts to dissolve as well, to where you really honestly don't even have any self-awareness at that point of being a being, of being a thing, of being in anything, of existing. You're just dissolved into the pure nirvanic bliss. And that's how I'm describing it, this bliss of just being the wave. And the closer my point of vision and perception got to it, to the center of this pure white light, I could see visually the form of the frequency. And sure enough, some part of me was still there to recognize it. It was the Om symbol, like you see in Hinduism. If you want to look it up, the Sanskrit symbol, how it's written, Om. It didn't sound like Om, like when we chanted Om. It didn't have that, but it was just this frequency that can't be articulated with any human voice or any sounds that we hear here in the sober reality. But that's what it was, that universal frequency at the origin point, at the beginning of all creation, at the center point of all of existence. And this is another thing I want to clarify too here about the ego death aspect, because I see a lot of psychonauts, or I guess newbie psychonauts on the internet, and ones I talk to in person and so forth. They claim they've experienced ego death even several times, but when you talk to them about their experience, what they're really describing is amnesia. And that's not ego death. It is a part of ego death. It is a necessary stage. It is a symptom, one of the many symptoms of undergoing the ego death. But ego death is not simply amnesia. But a lot of these people talk about that, like they'll say, like, I forgot who I was, man. I forgot where I was, and blah, 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 blah. So total ego death, man. If you still have any functionality as a living organism, in my opinion, you didn't undergo full ego death. You were having amnesia, which is one of the precursors. It means you were almost there. You were crossing the threshold, but you weren't quite there yet. Because ego death is ego death. You, anything that can still be called you, ceases to exist. And there's just the wave. There's just the frequency. But if you can still react, if you can still feel and have an emotion, if you can still get freaked out or get afraid or get giddy and like, oh my God, this is so great. If you can still recognize that you're having amnesia, your ego's still intact. You're not undergoing ego death. You had memory death. You didn't have ego death. If there's any part of you that's still functional and is anything other than just the wave, and just bleeding out and being one with the universe, with the multiverse, with all that exists, then as far as I'm concerned, you didn't really have ego death, as I would call it. All right, let me check my notes here because I want to make sure I touched on everything. But yeah, so when you reach this stage, this was where I experienced firsthand what other psychonauts like Bill Hicks and Terence McKenna have described. But in Bill Hicks in particular, where he says you realize that matter is just energy condensed to a slow vibration, and that we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively. And at this center point, at the beginning of creation, I'm not even sure there is any quality that can be called a consciousness. I guess there's still an observation effect going on. But I still, in hindsight, as I reflect back on that trip, I still wonder if that was really, if the observation effect was still an inherent property of the source, of the wave, or if that was just because my human body was still alive and still operating, and so it was still recording what was going on. And that's about the best metaphor I've been able to come up with to illustrate that point, is that imagine you have a photographer with a video camera who's recording an event, recording some phenomenon, and then he needs to go take a piss, grab a cup of coffee, whatever, and so he sets the video camera on auto setting and walks away and leaves the camera rolling to record the data that it's observing on auto setting. The photographer has walked away. The video camera itself is just a lifeless, non-sentient, non-conscious machine. It has no input into what it's recording. It has no reaction to what it's recording. It's not even aware that it is recording. It has no awareness or consciousness at all. It's just a lifeless machine, just purely recording data. And that, I would have to say, in an oversimplified nutshell, is what the ego death process is like. The photographer, in your mind, has walked away and just left the equipment running on autopilot, and that's the only reason there's still some kind of observation, awareness effect going on when you enter into these deep states on the other side of ego death. Because all that's left there at that stage is just the wave. You get absorbed into it, and you become it, and you realize you always were it. You were never not it. This, and the ego effect that comes from it, is just one of the many manifestations of it, along with everything else. I think another analogy that works to illustrate the process of ego death, in particular, the process of what I talked about earlier, where if the process is stretched out long enough so that it gives the ego enough time and chance to get a meta perspective on itself and to see itself dissolve and to witness itself, what it really is and how it's composed, and that it is just an effect produced by the sum of its parts, its non-conscious parts, is like this. Say you're in school and the teacher brings out one of those overhead projectors, which I may be dating myself with that reference. I don't know if kids in school are still familiar with those, if teachers still use those, but you know, the overhead projector that has the light at the bottom and the mirror lamp that, you know, she'll put a translucent piece of film that has a picture on it over the light on the base, and then that shines up and reflects out the mirror onto the projection screen that she pulls down over the chalkboard, and then you're seeing a blown up version of the illustration she has on that translucent sheet of film. Okay, so say you have one of those, say that's what's going on, and the teacher brings out 3 sheets of this translucent film, 3 different colors, the primary colors, red, yellow, blue, lays them all on top of each other on that light at the base of the projector screen. What you're going to get projected onto the screen is the color brown. But guess what? There is no brown film there. The brown actually doesn't exist. At least not in the way that the red, yellow, and blue film exist. The brown is just an illusion. It's just the sum of its parts. Brown doesn't even exist in the rainbow. Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, none of those are brown. You see a rainbow in the sky, you don't get brown. You expose a beam of light to a prism, a crystal, or whatever have you, you don't get brown. Brown is an illusion. Brown is an effect produced by the sum of its parts. Each one of those parts, none of them are actually brown. They're all originally white, fragmented into these 3 colors. So even when you put them all together, or like you re-merge them back into their original self, you still don't get brown. You get white. Brown is an illusion. And so, in this analogy, brown is the ego, the self. And when you enter into these altered states of consciousness, whether they're induced by psychedelics or trauma or meditation or hallucination or whatever have you, imagine the teacher is at that overhead projector and those 3 sheets of translucent film, the red, yellow, and blue, stacked on top of each other, she starts to pull them apart gradually so that there's still a space at the center where they're all 3 overlapped. So there's still a spot on the projection screen that is still brown at the center. But at the edges of them, you now start to see yellow pop out in the corner, and then red pop out of this corner, and then blue pop out of this corner. And the more she starts to separate them and pull them out, the smaller that shade of brown gets where the overlap is, and the more you see, oh, brown doesn't exist, it's not there, it's an illusion. What actually exists is red, yellow, and blue. And it's when it's only in the space where they overlap that the illusion of brown is produced. And that's the perspective that ego is given on itself. As these psychedelics kick in and escalate and take you into ego death, the ego starts to shrink, and the individual mind functions that compose it start to be pulled apart, and ego can actually observe the stages of how it gets produced. It's like, oh, there's this phenomenon over here, which is just a pure observation effect part of my mind. And then there's this function of my mind over here, which is just purely data processing, which I guess when you have the illusion of ego in full effect and you're fully sober, that's what creates this phenomenon of thoughts. I'm thinking right now, but you're not your thoughts. You observe your thoughts. And then a few other mind functions, which I don't really know how to articulate because I'm not a neuroscientist or anything like that, but when you're in this moment, you can see that. The ego gets this meta perspective on itself, and it can see the red, yellow, and blue that composes itself, the brown. And it's like, oh yeah, and it's not scary. It's not, I know it sounds that way. The ego always wants to resist itself being shut down. But once it finally starts happening and it gets this meta perspective on itself, it's more like a, oh, so I don't actually exist. Right, I remember now. I'm just a phenomenon. I'm not a tangible thing. I'm not a soul or whatever have you. I'm just a phenomenon. I am the effect produced by the sum of my parts. And get this, I'm actually the last stage of this process. The ego has no control or input into the process. It is the final result produced by the process, ergo the illusion of choice and free will. But we'll discuss that in the next video. But anyway, yeah, so that I would say, again, an oversimplified analogy, but still pretty adequate analogy for how this process of ego death and the ego witnessing itself being deconstructed happens. And definitely in the times I've experienced ego death since then, I definitely get this and as the chemical wears off after the peak and you start to come back down, it undergoes that same process in reverse and it starts to get reconstructed. And everything about the human experience feels new again. And hence I can see why you get these description in like ancient mystery schools and initiation rites of shamanistic traditions and whatnot, where people describe they feel like they've been born again or reborn anew, because you feel that way when the ego is deconstructed and then it's just gone, and then it gets reconstructed or reborn and everything feels new. It has to refamiliarize itself with the human experience. And I definitely, in all the times that I've experienced that, and I now have this sense of like the ego gets dismembered and put back together, and that this, some shamanistic form of this, is what's at the root of all these ancient traditions of these mystery schools and whatnot, of a god or a demigod protagonist gets killed, his body gets torn apart, and then later he gets put back together and resurrected, such as in the myths of Osiris out of Egypt, or Dionysus out of Greece, Bacchus out of Rome, Attis out of Phrygia, and so forth and so on. There's plenty of these. There's no shortage of these types of myths, this type of monomyth, this archetypal cycle, which I personally think these are all just metaphors, illustrations to illustrate the ego death process during these shamanistic rituals, which we now know today, many of them were incorporated usage of entheogenic plants and psychedelic substances. And so I do think that's, in many of these traditions, I think that's what was going on, was that it started out as some sort of shamanic initiation ritual, and to explain the process of ego death, or maybe even the person experiencing this, maybe this was even some of the imagery that they saw, was, like being Osiris and then being dismembered and then put back together. Because there has been some of these times where, in later trips, where I've experienced the ego death and then the reconstruction, where there are visual elements accompanying it. One in particular was like a lotus flower, like blossoming open, and the petals just kind of falling off. And this was definitely like analogous to, again, the individual mind functions that make up that lotus or that ego being pulled apart and then, dismembered, and then they come back together and they close back up as the drug is wearing off, and you're coming back down and the ego comes back into play and is reactivated. And so I definitely think that's, personally, I'm convinced that that's what's behind a lot of these myths. I think that's what's at the origin of this archetypal tale of a protagonist, some divine protagonist being slain, part of his flesh being dismembered and then put back together and being resurrected or born again. But be that as it may, another thing I got out of this experience was that I felt like I was being given a glimpse intuitively. I got these like telepathic impressions that I was being given a glimpse into the Platonic realm of forms. If any of you are familiar with like Plato's theology and cosmology and his infamous metaphor of the cave, and later on the Gnostics would incorporate that in their idea of this pleroma, where there's this realm of existence, there's this layer of existence that is just the pure eternal forms, the real world, I guess you could call it that. And it casts a shadow, and then, like by analogy, we who experience this reality, we are like prisoners chained in a cave, and the way we're chained up, the only vision we have is on the back wall of this cave, and there's a fire behind us, and that fire hits, the light from that fire hits these images of these real forms out in the real layer of existence, and casts these shadows on the back wall of this cave. And we, in this experience, everything about it, our bodies, everything about our physical environment here in this 3D temporal reality that we're experiencing here, these are just shadows in the cave. And that what's beyond this is the realm of eternal true forms that cast those shadows. And I got the sense, a very affirmative sense, that this pure white light that I witnessed and was absorbed into, that was the fire that cast that light. And then all these kaleidoscopes and mandala systems that cascade outward from that bursting forth of this white light, those were the true eternal forms that cast the shadows. And that finally, as you get far enough away from the center, from the source, to where you are here in this material world of matter, this is the shadow cast by those forms. And I did. I got a very affirmative sense of like, you're witnessing the real world, the real universe, the real realm of existence, these layers of existence outside of this one, but help compose this one. You're witnessing the Gnostic pleroma, and this right here is the kenoma. And so, yeah, like I was there in this state of bliss, this overwhelming sense of like comfort and familiarity and being home. It was very inviting. There was no part about this experience that was scary or undesirable. Again, the ego in its last moments before it's completely shut down, it does start to resist, but you know what? We have states of consciousness here in this sober reality where we shut down the ego temporarily, and sometimes that ego does resist, especially when you're a child. It's known as sleep, when you're literally unconscious. But for many of us, as you go through life, you learn to appreciate sleep and enjoy sleep, and you like the process of letting go and just falling asleep, letting your consciousness, and therefore the ego that consciousness produces, be shut down. At least temporarily. Again, it resurges when you get to the stage of sleep where you have dreams and so forth, but at least for some duration, it shuts down. And it's relaxing, it's relieving. And that's another thing, another aspect to this experience that I got a palpable sensation from was that, especially on the come down, when you start to come down, or I guess, reincarnate into this world of matter, you feel how exhausting it is to exist, at least in this form, how exhausting it is to think and have thoughts and to be a consciousness and be an ego, and how relaxing and relieving and reinvigorating it was to just bleed out and dissolve and just become the wave. Because when you're in that state and the ego is no longer in play, you don't have emotions anymore, which granted means you don't have the positive ones like, joy, love, hope, and all that. But by default, it means you also don't have the negative ones anymore. You don't have any fear in that state. You don't have any stress in that state. You don't have any anxiety in that state. You don't have any worries or concerns about, I can't stay in this state forever. I got to get up in the morning and go to work. All of that just dissolves away. You don't have to worry about a thing. And I remember after I came down and tried to integrate this experience, I remember being left with the impression and the conclusion that, like, if this is what the experience of death is, then I can see how people say, when I had this experience, I lost all my fear of death. Because this was a truly blissful experience. It was wonderful. And I want to clarify that it's not even so much like that all of your emotions and feelings and all the different aspects of experience get shut down or dissolve away or fade away or get deleted or anything like that. It's more like you see them for the illusion that they are, in that, just as I said earlier, when the white light gets fragmented by a prism into the 7 rainbow colors, so too in this experience, as you're going into it, as you're riding the wave and dissolving into the wave and into the white light, and everything just sort of converges back into this state of oneness, this singularity, you realize, you feel, and you experience firsthand, and you see, and you remember that all of your different spectrum of emotions are one and the same thing. They're this one and the same vibration, and it's only the prism, the filter of the human brain, that fragments them and splits them into the spectrum of emotions. In that moment, you feel all of your emotions you've ever felt at one and the same time, and they complement each other. Even the negative ones are no longer negative in that moment, in that experience. You're simultaneously experiencing hate and then love, and then, peace, and then fear and anxiety and hope and so forth. You're feeling them all at the same time, and they all start to converge back into this original frequency which they came from. And you realize what you hear all these, Eastern philosophers and New Age hippie gurus and stuff talk about when they say all those things are just an illusion. It's all just one, and they all blend back together, and the sum is greater. Like the effect that's produced is greater than the sum of its parts. It becomes this nirvanic bliss, this overwhelming bliss, this overwhelming positive feel-good sensation. And it's the only thing left in that state, is just being the wave, just riding the wave. It's not even an emotion anymore at that point. It's just this feeling of vibrating at that frequency of being the wave. And when I say even the negative emotions become positive in that experience, it's like, again, by metaphor, analogy, it's like, imagine a flavor that you like, say cinnamon. If you eat pure cinnamon by itself, it's very bitter, it's very spicy. But when you blend it with something that's positive, like say sugar and dough, you get a very tasty treat. The sum of all those parts is pure positive, no negativity to it, even if cinnamon by itself is what we might say is a negative taste. Again, same thing with like cocoa. If you like chocolate, you ever eaten just pure cocoa powder by itself? It's very bitter. It doesn't taste good, but you mix that cocoa powder with sugar and milk, you have chocolate, something that is all around 100% delicious. And it's like that. It's like, even when you're experiencing the hate and the fear, you recognize them as those things, but as they're converging with everything else, the sum total is just this pure nirvanic bliss. And you realize you're supposed to feel all of those things. You can't experience one side without the other. It's this yin and yang blending effect. And it's not just with the emotions. It's with everything. Physical, everything that can be called an experience blends back together, and you realize it's all just fragmented aspects, different ranges of frequency within this one source. Again, they're all just fragmented colors of light broken by the prism that were originally just white. And that's how every bit of existence is. It all just converges back into that oneness that you remember when you're there. Like, oh yeah, this is where we all came from. This is what we all are. We are all that right now, currently. We never stop being that. And this is what we dissolve back into when we finish playing this game of being a human, of human life. And in that respect, when I reflected back on this experience after the fact, it was almost verbatim what is described by Matthew McConaughey's character known as Rust Cole in the HBO series True Detective. And you can find clips of this speech that I'm describing on YouTube. It's very popular. Now, although the character is very pessimistic, admittedly, and he gives this speech from a tone of a lot of doom and gloom, when you experience it firsthand, because the character didn't have any experience with what he was talking about, he was just being speculative, he was just philosophizing about life and existence. But when you enter these altered states of consciousness and the ego gets shut down and you experience them firsthand, it correlates with everything he said in that speech. In that, and I had to kind of write this down, so I'm going to do a lot of reading at this point, but it's like when he talks about how he witnessed the finale of thousands of lives, and as he's looking over the countless crime scene pics, and he says that no matter if they're dead or alive or in a photograph or you're with the corpse firsthand, you can still read them. You can look at their face and look into their eyes, and you can still read them. And you know what you see? All of them, 100% of them, they welcomed it. Not at first, but in just that last instant, that last nanosecond, they saw for the first time how easy it was to just let go. And it really was like that. You might feel some anxiety as it's ascending, as these are new sensations you've never experienced before, at least the human ego has never experienced them before. And as that voice reassures you and calms you down and lets you know, just let go, just ride the wave. You feel, it feels comfortable. It feels inviting and reassuring and almost metaphorically like a hug from a mother figure. It is easy to just let go. But yeah, he says they were afraid at first, but then they saw for the first time what they really were. And they saw that this whole big drama, this whole theater of life, of existence, it was nothing but a jerry-rig of presumption and dumb will. You could just let go. Because they finally saw for the first time that they didn't have to hold on so tight. And when you come back down out of such an experience, granted this wasn't literal death, this was ego death, but I imagine that when you actually die, your ego's gonna die too. And yeah, you realize, like, you didn't have to hold on to all of this so tightly because it was just a dream, an illusion. What were you even holding on to? Do we try to hold on to dreams that tightly? I mean, sometimes we kind of do when we're having a really pleasant and fulfilling dream, and then we get suddenly startled out of it, and we kind of complain like, dude, why'd you wake me up? I was having the best dream. But even then, we still come to terms with the fact that it was just a dream. There's no capturing it. It's like trying to grab the air and hold on to it. You can't. It's an illusion. It's holographic. It's not concrete. It's not real. It's not eternal. And once you come to terms with that, you realize how easy it is to just let go and just dissolve back into the source and just ride the wave. And as the character goes on to iterate, to realize in that moment that your whole life, everything about it, all your fear, all your hope, all your memory, all your pain, it was all the same thing. It was all the same dream. A dream that you had inside of a locked room. A dream about being a person. And it's exactly like that. As I just described, you realize your whole life, all of the emotions, all the experiences you've had, they were all the same thing. They were all just fragmented spectrums of this one frequency, this one white light, this one source. And it's another aspect of this of I guess existence and how it's constructed that you're kind of given insight to in these moments, especially on the come down, and you're kind of given this bird's eye view as you're descending back down into, I guess, human levels of consciousness, is that as you see this light burst forth and then it gets fragmented and then it takes on forms, kaleidoscope fractals, and then organized mandalas, and then finally after that universes, three-dimensional physical spaces, matter, realms of matter, and biology and human life, atomic worlds, I guess. As you see that process, you almost have this like physical, visual mapping out of how it gets constructed, and you realize if we are the shadows, and those are the real forms that cast the shadows, it's the emotions that come first. And the moments of this human life experience are written around that to give a story to that. But it's the emotion that comes first and then produces the moments of the human life, not vice versa. In that respect, it's just like in a dream. That's how these moments happen in a dream. Like, I'm pretty sure we've all had this experience. Have you ever had to pee while you're asleep? And guess what happens? It's your literal physical body that's asleep that has to pee. That happens first. Then what happens? Then your dream starts to take on a form around that. It writes a scenario and experience around that. And then in the dream, you realize you have to pee and you start looking for a bathroom, and then you either can't find one, or if you do find one, it's occupied because, you know, some part of you yourself knows that you can't actually piss while you're asleep in your bed. You need to wake up and get up and go to a real bathroom. But that's just it. The feeling of having to pee came first. Then your dream, then your experience writes a story around that feeling. And that's what produces the moment. This phenomenon of having an experience. Same thing with, like, if you're hungry while you're asleep. You get the hunger pangs first. Then your dream writes a story around that for you to experience. Then it's the same thing. Then your character that you are in your dream starts looking around for something to eat, and even sometimes finds food and eats it, but then is not satisfied because obviously your real body is external to the dream, so it's still hungry. It's not satisfied. Or other such things, like if you've been asleep when it's too cold or too hot, and you dream about finding a thermostat and turning the thermostat to the appropriate temperature and covering up with more blankets and things of that nature. The feelings came first. Then your mind wrote an experience around that. And you see that process happen, especially, like I said, on the descent back down, as the chemicals wearing off and you're coming back into the ego rebirth and back down into human consciousness, though there's still very much under the influence of the chemical. You're not sober yet, but the point being, you see that process happen. Like, the light gets fragmented and cascaded into colors, and then those get cascaded into shapes, and then those get cascaded into other frequencies that we, when we absorb them, we experience them as emotions. But those frequencies, those feelings, those emotions come first in the process. And then as they continue to descend downward and take on the form of, like, this 3D physical universe in which humans live and have the phenomenon of experience, the moments of our lives are written around that. And you see the illusion that is free will and choice. And some of the things touching on that, like, say, out of the Matrix movies, start to make sense. Like, for instance, my mind is reminded of the conversation between Neo and the Oracle when they were on the park bench in the second movie. And she offers him candy, and Neo is like, well, do you know if I'm already going to take it or not? And she goes, of course I do. I wouldn't be much of an oracle if I didn't. And Neo goes, well, how can I make a choice if it's already predetermined what I'm going to do? And she explains to him, because you're not here to make the choice. You already made it. You're here to understand why you made the choice. And, you know, changing up the terminology a little bit, I would say that's quite accurate. You're not here to make the choice. You already made the choice, or rather, you already, the source that we all descend from, that you truly are, it already predetermined that this moment was going to happen when it fragmented into the emotional perspectives. And then it wrote a moment around that. It wrote an experience to have around that, I guess, choice, for lack of a better word. And maybe what I just said, maybe all this part is incoherent, and it doesn't make sense to any of you out there listening who have never had these experiences, but yeah, you realize not only just the illusion that the ego is, but the illusion of choice and free will, and you do start to get this sense of, like, a predestination. But again, not in any kind of scary or constrained kind of way, because it's not like it's this immutable force that you can't resist. It's you. Yes, your life was pre-written, but by you, as the pure white light. And it wasn't written, you know, consciously with any sort of conscious, deliberate effort, because that state of existence, again, in my experience of it, it did not have consciousness. Consciousness is one of the many effects that it produces, same as, you know, life and everything else. And so, yeah, that was another significant part of this experience that I took away from it. And so, yeah, I kind of pretty much experienced what Russ Cole explains in that speech from that show, but in a positive way, not with this pessimistic doom and gloom with which the character presents it. I would say that's definitely more the ego's perspective on this phenomenon. Of course, the ego doesn't want to be shut down and undergo death. so it resists, and so it probably has a very negative, pessimistic perspective on the experience that I just illustrated. But once that gets shut down, once you just let go, give into it, there's nothing negative or pessimistic about it. It's the most blissful experience you could ever have. It's home. It's your true self, your true state of just being the Om frequency, just riding the wave, and then being the wave, being the singularity, being all that is, which you always were and never stopped being. So yeah, so that happened, and the only thing that really pulled me out of it was my friend's dog came up to me. You know, obviously, as I said earlier in the video, I'm just lying on this paved walkway that leads into the courtyard, just kind of sunbathing and having this experience in my mind, and getting lost connection with, and lost any awareness of the fact that I was a human in a human body lying in a yard somewhere. And this dog eventually wandered its way up to me and started, sniffing at me and putting its, muzzle up to my face. And, I'm sure if I'm, lying there zoned out, it must have been a little bit concerned, like, hey, you okay, buddy? And the dog started putting its muzzle up to my face, kind of trying to snap me out of it. And it did, so to speak. Didn't completely snap me out of the trip state, but it kind of brought me, like, suddenly, like, jerked me out of this Nirvana state. And I saw it, like, it accompanied, almost like when people describe these near-death experiences, like, I went through this vortex of light. It was kind of like that, like, I was in the light, and I was the light, and I was this wave. And then once the dog, like, touched my human body and kind of reawakened my senses, that point of perception was just, like, vacuum sucked, suddenly, like, pulled back out and fell through this vacuum of light, and then through the colors and the kaleidoscopes and the mandalas, and bam, like, landed right back here in this human body. And I opened my eyes, and again, it was just like I had x-ray vision. Everything still looked exactly the same. All the colors and fragments were everywhere. I could look up at the sun, it looked like the pure white light, and everything was emanating out from it and forming the kaleidoscopes and then the mandalas and then this universe. And I looked at myself, and it was still just a silhouette of a human body, but composed of colorful fractals that were spinning around and whatnot. And I looked at the dog, and I recognized the dog, especially because it was panting and making other dog sounds. But it too was just a silhouette of colors and fractals and whatnot. And that was pretty wild. And so, I petted the dog so that it wouldn't, know that I was okay and leave me alone, and walked away. And laid back down and closed my eyes, and just immediately could undergo the same experience again. Just much quicker this time. It wasn't like some slow ascent, but it was just like, as soon as I just like, okay, that's over with, just lay back down, just let go, and just ride the wave. And boom, like my consciousness, my point of perception, all these other things, thoughts, emotions, reactions, and shit, they were all shut down. And I was just this point of perception, being the wave and being the light, until, I probably stayed, I mean, in an objective sense, I may have stayed in that state for another good 15, 20 minutes. Though again, when you're in it, time is meaningless, so it might as well be eternity. And then finally, the drug started to wear off, and I, slowly drifted back out of the space of the light and through the colors, and kind of regained some wherewithal. The ego started to come back into play and be reconstructed, and I just kind of was met with this moment of like, oh, right. I mean, I am the light, but I am also, one aspect of that is that I am this human, Donnie Jepp, and I'm lying in a yard somewhere, and I should probably get up now and resume being a human. And that's what I did. So yeah, that was something, and that was reassuring. And this experience of Nirvana and of returning to the source has kind of been my anchor throughout all the other crazy shit I would experience, both in life, in sober life, but also the other crazy and very intense and oftentimes even disturbing psychedelic experiences I would have after this moment. This nirvanic experience has been my anchor and my source of reassurance. So that no matter what I experienced on other psychedelic trips, even when they show me ridiculous shit that's like I said, kind of disturbing and shocking, like, no, that can't really be the case, can it? I'm always reminded of this nirvanic experience. And I remember that everything else, no matter what the experience is an illusion. And at the end of the day, it all emanates from that source, from that singularity, from that big bang that is always and forever banging always creating, always becoming, and always being us, all of us, all of it. And so at the end of the day, no matter what I'm shown on other psychedelic trips or other states of consciousness, those two are just illusions. And when it's all said and done, well, I'll just return to that source, to that bliss that feels so good, to just let go and to drift away and fall asleep into forever. And yeah, I would like to say it completely eliminated my fear of death, but I can't say that. Maybe in a psychological sense it did, but obviously I'm still inhabiting a human body that still has all these human primate instincts that it has evolved over millions of years, and so naturally, in a physical sense, I do feel fear when I'm in moments of compromised safety. But I would say at the end of the day, psychologically, I don't have any fear of death. I don't have that existential anxiety of like, what's going to happen? Am I just going to completely cease to exist or what? And no, I've experienced what's going to happen. And that's what made it the greatest experience of my life. And I hope if you who are watching decide to partake of altered states of consciousness, especially through the avenue of psychedelic substances, I hope you someday have that experience as well and get as much out of it as I did. Thanks for watching.